The match of shame, Chile vs. USSR. 1973. The shadow before the stadium when football met fair in the months that followed the coup. Chile tried to convince the world that life had returned to normal. But beneath the illusion, the heartbeat of fear pulsed through every street, every household, and every stadium gate. Newspapers printed photos of smiling soldiers handing bread to children, while in secret, thousands disappeared into the night, taken to interrogation centers that no one dared to name. Amidst this orchestrated silence, football reemerged as both a distraction and a weapon of propaganda. The Chilean national team, still reeling from the shock of political collapse, found itself suddenly thrust into a new role, to represent a new Chile, one disciplined, obedient, and victorious under the banner of Pinochet. Many players were torn, loyal to their country, but fearful of what their participation symbolized. Some had friends or relatives among the detained. Others knew exactly what was happening behind the closed gates of Estadio Nacional, for whispers traveled even in darkness. Yet refusing to play was not an option. To decline the honor of representing Chile now meant defiance. And defiance was a death sentence. As the 1974 FIFA World Cup qualifiers unfolded, the Chilean squad advanced through their early matches with cautious determination. The final obstacle stood in the form of a powerful, disciplined adversary, the Soviet Union. The Cold War rivalry gave this match a significance far beyond football. It was socialism versus dictatorship, red against red, a symbolic showdown between two worlds that had once shared ideological sympathy through Allende, but now faced each other as enemies. The first leg was held in Moscow on September 26, 1973, just 15 days after the coup. Snow fell lightly over the Lenin Stadium, and the Chilean players, nervous and subdued, faced a hostile crowd of over 60,000 Soviet supporters. Reports from journalists described them as pale, silent, and visibly shaken. Rumors had reached Europe about mass executions back home, about the very stadium that was supposed to host the return match now being used as a prison. The game itself ended in a tense 0-0 draw, a score that should have promised an exciting decider in Santiago. But the Soviets, appalled by the news emerging from Chile, began questioning whether the second leg should even take place. By October, foreign newspapers were leaking testimonies from survivors of Estadio Nacional, revealing that thousands of detainees were still held there under military supervision. Some had been tortured in the dressing rooms, others executed in the inner tunnel leading to the field. Photographs smuggled out of Santiago showed soldiers standing guard around the stands, where football fans once sang anthems. The Soviet Football Federation, upon receiving this evidence, issued a formal protest to FIFA, declaring that their team would not play on the field soaked with the blood of the Chilean people. The statement was both moral and political, and it threw FIFA into a storm. At the time, FIFA was desperate to appear apolitical, the guardian of football's global purity. Yet this illusion had been challenged before and would be tested again. Inside FIFA's headquarters in Zurich, officials debated fiercely. Some argued that the Chilean junta had to be condemned. Others insisted that sport must remain separate from politics. Privately, letters were exchanged between Pinochet's regime and FIFA representatives promising that the stadium was no longer in use for political purposes. To verify this, a FIFA inspection team was dispatched to Santiago in early November. What they saw, or rather, what they were allowed to see, became one of the most shameful inspections in sports history. The Chilean military, forewarned of their arrival, cleared the visible areas of the stadium, moved prisoners to other camps for the day, and ordered soldiers to paint over bullet marks on the walls. The grass was trimmed, new nets were hung, and flags waved proudly as the inspectors toured a sanitized stage. Meanwhile, in the stadium's underground cells, dozens of prisoners remained locked in silence, forbidden to make a sound. One survivor later recalled hearing footsteps above and the echo of laughter. FIFA men, walking on the roof of our prison, smiling at the generals. The inspectors declared the stadium fit for play. It was a lie that would stain FIFA's legacy forever. When the Soviets received the report, they refused to yield. The Soviet Sports Committee reiterated that their team would not travel to Chile. So long as fascist crimes continue in that stadium, Western media framed it as political theater. But to those who understood the magnitude of what was happening in Chile, it was an act of dignity. The Cold War lens, however, twisted everything. Western governments accused the USSR of hypocrisy and propaganda, while Chile's junta used the refusal as proof that communists feared the strength of the new Chile. Within Chile, propaganda posters appeared showing the national team as warriors of freedom. Radio commentators declared that the Soviets were too afraid to face the brave Chilean lion. Yet behind these lies, even players like Francisco Valdez and Carlos Cashley privately struggled with the moral weight of what they were part of. Cashley, known for his courage on and off the pitch, would later admit that he felt dirty wearing the shirt during that time, though to speak out then would have meant imprisonment or worse. As November approached, the junta ordered the match to proceed as planned. The official date was set, November 21, 1973. FIFA, unwilling to risk diplomatic conflict, confirmed it. The second leg of the World Cup playoff between Chile and the USSR would take place in Estadio Nacional, regardless of Soviet participation, and so the stage was set for one of the most surreal and haunting spectacles in the history of sport. The propaganda machine rolled forward, preparing banners, press releases, and military ceremonies to show the world that Chile was peaceful and united. But under the surface, beneath every inch of that polished grass, lay a truth no amount of whitewash could erase. The ghosts of the disappeared still lingered in the tunnels, their cries trapped beneath layers of silence. Soldiers rehearsed their positions in the stands not as guards but as spectators, ensuring that when the cameras rolled, the world would see discipline, not dictatorship. As the day drew near, the tension grew unbearable. The Soviet Union had officially declared that it would not send its team, and yet FIFA refused to cancel the game. The order came from the top of the Chilean command: the match will be played. Even if the other team does not come, it will be played. Players whispered among themselves. How could a football match exist without an opponent? But in the logic of tyranny, symbolism mattered more than fairness. The match would happen, because it had to happen, to prove to the world that Pinochet's Chile stood victorious, not only on the battlefield but on the world's greatest stage. And so, as the sun began to set over Santiago on that fateful evening in November, thousands of Chileans, some by choice, many by fear, filled the stands of Estadio Nacional. Soldiers stood disguised as fans, their rifles hidden beneath blankets. The flag of Chile waved proudly in the wind, covering the scars on the concrete where blood had once dried. On the field, 11 Chilean players stood in formation, staring at the empty half where their opponents should have been. The referee blew his whistle. The crowd held its breath, and what followed would become one of the most shameful moments in football history. The silence before the next whistle half a century later. In an age of digital stadiums and billion-dollar broadcasts, the memory of that impossible game still flickers like a ghost between the pixels of modern football, a reminder that the world's most beloved sport is also one of its most revealing mirrors. Young fans scrolling through archives stumble upon the grainy black and white footage of Santiago, November 1973, and pause in disbelief at the sight of 11 men kicking toward an empty goal, their faces solemn beneath the glare of floodlights. And for a fleeting second, history breathes again. The questions that haunted Chile now belong to everyone. How could the world have watched and stayed silent? How could a governing body dedicated to fair play pretend not to see? And what does that say about all of us who celebrate victories while ignoring what lies outside the frame? Because even today, in stadiums from Doha to Moscow to Buenos Aires, the tension between conscience and competition continues to pulse beneath the grass. FIFA's modern leaders speak of inclusion and unity. Their conferences fill with slogans about the global family of football, yet every so often, during a moment of controversy or protest silenced, a journalist detained, a match played amid conflict, the world remembers the night when the ball rolled into an empty net, and history failed its test. And still, something redemptive endures in Chile. The Estadio Nacional stands not as a wound, but as a living memorial. Its gates bearing the names of the disappeared, it stands hosting concerts, finals, and national celebrations where the cheers are not only for goals, but for survival. The descendants of those who vanished sometimes sit beside fans draped in red and blue, sharing both grief and pride. While outside, murals of Cashfley, Valdez, and the anonymous prisoners stretch across concrete walls, merging heroes and victims into one long tapestry of remembrance. Even FIFA, prodded by historians and activists, now funds heritage projects that acknowledge football's political past. And though the organization never issued a direct apology, its archives now include exhibits on the match of shame, displayed beside other moments when the game's moral compass faltered. Every year, journalists rediscover the story, filmmakers recreate it, and teachers retell it, not because they wish to reopen the wound, but because within that eerie silence of 1973 lies one of football's purest lessons: that integrity is not measured by trophies, but by the courage to refuse the easy lie. And so, when the national anthem echoes once more through the same stands, when new generations of Chilean players walk onto the pitch beneath a flag that now represents democracy, they carry a hidden inheritance, the promise that their cheers will never again be forced, that every whistle will be free. Somewhere in the noise of modern matches under drone cameras, neon advertisements, and digital chants, the faintest echo of that long-ago game still whispers a truth beyond all tactics, and titles that a sport without conscience is only a shadow of its beauty, and that the truest victory in football, as in life, is not in scoring a goal, but in remembering what it means to be human. The echo after the whistle when the floodlights of Estadio Nacional finally dimmed that November night. The echo of that single whistle seemed to hang over Chile for years, a sound that no cheering could erase. And in the days that followed, the dictatorship celebrated its hollow victory with parades, front-page photographs, and proclamations that sport and order had triumphed. Yet behind the smiling faces printed on government posters, unease crept through the nation's conscience. For the people knew what had really happened, and so did the players who had stood on that field, their boots still damp with dew and doubt, their names recorded in the official books as heroes of qualification, but in their hearts as unwilling actors in a national illusion. Francisco Valdez was handed a medal he never displayed. Carlos Cashfley, privately tormented, told close friends that the silence in the stadium had been louder than any crowd, and some teammates, too frightened to speak, avoided each other for months, as though conversation itself might betray them, while the generals used their images in propaganda films shown before cinema screenings, the ball rolling across the screen to slogans about discipline and patriotism. And in Europe, the footage replayed on television with disbelief, commentators describing it as a match without soul, an absurdity that exposed the moral vacuum of both FIFA and the junta. Newspapers from Paris to Buenos Aires printed editorials demanding accountability, though the world's attention soon drifted back to oil crises and political scandals, leaving Chileans to carry their shame largely alone. Within FIFA headquarters, the incident was quietly filed away, a bureaucratic embarrassment best forgotten. And in the following months, the organization issued a single, bloodless statement confirming Chile's participation in the 1974 World Cup, a decision that left many within the sport sickened by how easily principle had been traded for protocol. When the team arrived in West Germany the following June, they were greeted not as villains but as curiosities. Yet their performance bore the weight of what they had left behind: 3 matches, 2 draws, 1 defeat, and an early exit that felt more like penance than competition. Their spirits dulled, their movements mechanical, as if each pass carried the memory of that empty net back home. In Santiago, the junta declared even this outcome honorable, using it to reinforce the narrative of resilience under the new regime. While the players returned to a country still wrapped in fear, their fame now a fragile shield. Years slipped by, seasons changed, and still no one within the corridors of power spoke the name of the prisoners, who had vanished beneath the stands. But mothers and widows gathered quietly outside the stadium's gates, leaving flowers and photographs along the concrete walls. turning that place of spectacle into an unspoken memorial long before any government acknowledged it. Meanwhile, the global football community slowly began to confront its own complicity. Historians, journalists, and filmmakers in the 1980s and 1990s pieced together the hidden truths through survivor testimony, uncovering how FIFA inspectors had walked above detention cells, how the match's broadcast had been staged to conceal soldiers among the crowd, how that goal, struck so gently by Valdez, had become a symbol of moral collapse. By the time Chile regained democracy in 1990, Estadio Nacional had been cleansed of its barbed wire and reopened to the public. Yet for many who entered it again, the roar of the crowd carried undertones of grief. Ceremonies of remembrance began to appear before matches. Small at first, just candles on the sidelines. A minute of silence observed by players who were children in 1973, but growing over time into an annual ritual of collective reckoning. Abroad, the phrase "match of shame" entered football lore as shorthand for every moment when sport bowed before tyranny, a cautionary tale taught alongside the triumphs of Pelé and Maradona, reminding future generations that a stadium can become a courtroom of conscience. And for FIFA, the incident lingered like an unhealed bruise, resurfacing whenever new controversies about politics and sport rose, forcing officials to repeat the same tired line that football must remain separate from politics, even as the world remembered the night when that separation proved impossible. In the end, what survived from that evening in 1973 was not a scoreline, but a question whispered through history. What is victory, and what does it cost? For the Chilean players who kicked that lonely ball, for the spectators who clapped because they had to, for the millions who believed that a game could remain pure in the face of power, and for every fan who would one day look upon the field and wonder whether the grass beneath their heroes' feet had ever hidden something it could not confess. The game that never wastes morning of November 21st, 1973. Dawn cold and eerily calm over Santiago, a silence that felt almost rehearsed, as though the entire city had been instructed to hold its breath. From the hills, smoke still curled from old army depots, and posters of General Pinochet smiled from walls once painted with slogans of freedom. Soldiers marched in synchronized lines along the avenues leading to Estadio Nacional, their boots striking the pavement with the precision of a parade but the mood of a funeral. The Chilean national team gathered quietly in the dressing room, each player wrapped in the uneasy stillness that comes when duty and conscience collide. They had been told this would be a symbolic victory, that the Soviet Union's refusal to appear was an act of cowardice, and that Chile would show the world its strength. But deep down, every man in that room understood that the match ahead would not be a contest. It would be a performance, staged for cameras, designed to turn a nation's suffering into spectacle. Outside, the stands filled slowly. Thousands of civilians, many escorted by uniformed officers, took their seats with a mixture of confusion and fear. Some believed a real match would take place. Others simply followed orders to attend, knowing that absence might raise suspicion. On the pitch, the grass gleamed unnaturally green, freshly watered, hiding the scars of a place that weeks earlier had held prisoners beneath its concrete belly. At exactly 6:30 p.m., the stadium lights blazed to life, washing the field in white. A military band played the Chilean national anthem with martial precision, the brass echoing across the empty goalmouth on the far side of the field, where the Soviet players should have stood. When the anthem ended, the referee dressed formally, as if for ceremony rather than sport, walked to the center circle, whistle poised between his lips. The world's press, though limited in number, turned their cameras toward the field, ready to capture history's strangest kickoff. The referee blew his whistle. 11 Chilean players began to move hesitantly toward the ball. The captain, Francisco Valdez, passed it to teammate Carlos Cashley, whose touch was light, almost reluctant, as though he feared the ground itself might reject it. The ball rolled forward a few meters before Valdez advanced again, stopped, and gently pushed it into the open net. The goalkeeper on the Soviet side did not exist. There was only air, only silence, and then the sound of polite, forced applause. The referee nodded, signaling a goal. 1-0. A match had been played without opposition, a victory declared without contest. And a dictator's message sent to the world: Chile triumphs. The players barely celebrated. Many simply walked off the field, their faces blank, their steps heavy. The match, if it could be called that, had lasted less than 90 seconds. The crowd's applause soon faded into uneasy murmurs. Some spectators wept quietly, not from joy, but from something closer to shame. They knew what the world would see: a nation pretending to play while its people suffered unseen. For the dictatorship, though, the spectacle was a success. Newspapers the next morning carried triumphant headlines: Chile victorious. The Soviets forfeit in fear. Photographs showed smiling generals shaking hands with players, as if to bless their performance. FIFA, having received the official report, confirmed the result: Chile won. Soviet Union 0. Chile qualified for the 1974 World Cup. The page of history turned. But the stain remained. Beyond Chile, the world reacted with disbelief. In Europe, sports journalists condemned the decision as a theater of cruelty. The French newspaper L'Equipe wrote that football has been used to hide the cries of men. In Moscow, the Soviet press denounced FIFA for collaboration with fascism. Across Latin America, whispers grew louder, whispers that one could disappear for asking the wrong question. But whispers nonetheless. Too many Chileans. The image of Valdez scoring into an empty net became a haunting metaphor, a nation scoring against itself. As weeks passed, the players returned to training, their bodies preparing for the World Cup, but their minds burdened with doubt. Cashly, known for his moral courage, would later confess that that night never left him, that every cheer he heard afterward carried an echo of those missing voices. Some teammates avoided speaking of it entirely, preferring to lose themselves in the rhythm of football, pretending it was still only a game. But in the corners of Santiago, where families searched for the disappeared and survivors carried memories too heavy to name, that goal remained an open wound. The field of Estadio Nacional, scrubbed clean for the cameras, could not erase what it had witnessed beneath its grass. When the 1974 World Cup finally arrived in West Germany, Chile played poorly, perhaps unsurprisingly. Their spirits were low, their minds elsewhere. They were eliminated in the group stage without winning a single match. The world moved on, as it always does, distracted by newer headlines, fresher tragedies. Yet the photograph of that empty stadium lingered, a team lined up against nothing, a referee enforcing the rules of an illusion. Years later, as Chile slowly returned to democracy, the truth of those months would resurface in testimonies and court hearings, and the match would stand as one of the clearest symbols of how power can twist sport into propaganda. But that night, in November 1973, as the lights dimmed and the crowd dispersed, the stadium returned to silence. Somewhere beneath the stands, the last prisoners were being transferred, their names soon to vanish from official records. Above them, on the surface, the grass glowed softly under the lamps, as if nothing had happened at all. The world saw a scoreline: Chile 1, USSR 0, and in that lie, the dictator found victory. Football, the world's most beautiful game, had been used as camouflage for one of its ugliest truths. The weight of memory years became decades, and the echoes of that short, surreal match refused to fade. Chile's dictatorship tightened its grip through the late 70s, then loosened gradually as the world's winds of change reached the southern hemisphere. And when democracy finally returned in 1990, the first beams of morning light fell again on the same stadium that had once been both theater and prison, its concrete newly painted, its grass once more prepared for sport. Yet everyone who stepped inside felt a chill beneath the surface, as if the ground itself remembered. And so began a long national effort to reconcile celebration with remembrance. In the new democratic era, commissions of truth collected testimonies from survivors who spoke carefully of what they had endured. And among those stories, the image of the empty football match returned again and again as the purest symbol of how normal life had been twisted to serve fear. The players, now older, gave interviews at last. Carlos Cashly, his hair gray but his voice steady, admitted that kicking the ball that night had been like passing it through a shadow. and Francisco Valdez, before his death in 2009, confessed that the goal he scored had haunted him more than any defeat, saying that every time he walked past a football field he thought of the people who could no longer play. Meanwhile, historians and journalists unearthed forgotten documents, FIFA memos, diplomatic cables, photographs of the inspection visit, and pieced together the chain of choices that had led the world's governing body of football to ignore its conscience. And as these findings spread, a younger generation of fans who had never lived through the dictatorship began to demand acknowledgement. By the mid-1990s, small plaques appeared around Estadio Nacional, marking places where detainees had been held. And in 2003, the Chilean government formally declared parts of the stadium a memorial site, turning dressing rooms once used by players into exhibition halls filled with photographs, letters, and silent jerseys that reminded visitors that every victory celebrated on that pitch carried the responsibility of memory. Abroad, documentaries and books translated the story for global audiences, and each retelling seemed to strip away another layer of denied. European broadcasters replayed the old footage. Scholars compared it to other moments when sport intersected with authoritarianism, and FIFA, confronted by journalists, offered half-hearted words about lessons learned but never an apology. Yet in the living culture of Chile, remembrance grew stronger than regret. Artists painted murals of the vanished. Poets wrote verses about the goal into the void. And every year on the anniversary of that November evening, supporters gathered with candles along the stands, singing softly not to celebrate a team but to honor resilience. In classrooms, teachers used the story to show how even something as joyful as football could be manipulated by fear. And in sports programs, coaches told their players that integrity mattered more than trophies. When Chile hosted international matches in the 21st century, visiting teams often paused to lay wreaths at the memorial plaques before kickoff, and television cameras lingered respectfully on the bronze engraving that read, "Un pueblo con memoria construye su futuro," a people with memory builds its future. Gradually, the match of shame transformed from an open wound into a shared conscience, a reminder that history is not erased by repainting a wall or scoring a goal, but by confronting what those acts tried to conceal. And somewhere in that transformation, the nation rediscovered its voice, learning that the same stadium that once silenced could also echo with truth, and that perhaps the truest victory born of that infamous 1-0 was not written on a scoreboard but inscribed in the collective vow that never again would Chile or football itself allow the beauty of the game to be used to disguise the suffering of its people. The match of shame, Chile versus USSR, 1973. The shadow before the stadium in the restless dawn of the 1970s, when the world trembled between the icy breaths of the Cold War. South America was not merely a continent of passion and football. It was a battlefield of ideologies, where every cheer in a stadium echoed against the roar of political unrest. Among its nations, Chile stood as a symbol of democratic hope, a narrow strip of land pressed between the Andes and the Pacific, vibrant in culture, proud in spirit, and deeply divided in belief. In 1970, after decades of conservative rule, Chile dared to elect Salvador Allende, a soft-spoken doctor turned socialist visionary, as its president. His promise was radical yet human: to uplift the poor, nationalize the copper mines, and make education and healthcare the rights of every citizen. But to the powerful in Washington, Allende's dream sounded like a red flag fluttering too close to home. As Allende's reforms began reshaping Chilean society, resistance brewed not only among local elites, but also in the quiet corridors of the CIA, which, under the orders of President Richard Nixon, set in motion one of the most infamous covert operations in Latin American history. Codenamed Project Fubil, it sought to make the economy scream, destabilize the government, and clear the path for a military coup. Yet amid this storm, Chileans clung to their joys, and nothing united them more than football. The nation's love for the game ran deep, from the dusty pitches of Valparaiso to the echoing stands of Estadio Nacional de Santiago, the national stadium that stood as a temple of hope. It was there that crowds once roared for glory, where players like Elias Figueroa had become legends, and where the Chilean flag waved high with pride. No one could have imagined that in just 3 years, that same stadium would transform into a hell of screams and gunfire. By mid-1973, tension had reached a boiling point. Strikes paralyzed the country, protests filled the streets, and whispers of rebellion filled the air. On the morning of September 11, 1973, as dawn painted the sky over Santiago, the air suddenly broke with the roar of jet engines. The Chilean Air Force bombed La Moneda Palace, where President Allende stood defiantly, refusing to flee his post. Surrounded and outnumbered, he delivered his final radio address, a haunting farewell promising that sooner rather than later, the great avenues will again be open where free men will walk. Minutes later, the building was stormed and Allende was dead. Whether he took his own life or was executed remains a debate of shadows. But what followed is not. General Augusto Pinochet, a once trusted military commander, seized power and unleashed a reign of terror that would scar the nation for decades. In the days that followed, thousands were rounded up: students, teachers, unionists, poets, anyone suspected of loyalty to Allende. The National Stadium, the same sacred field where victories were once celebrated, was now encircled by barbed wire and armed soldiers. Its locker rooms became interrogation chambers, its stands prison cells, and its underground corridors execution grounds. Witnesses spoke of men blindfolded on the pitch, hearing the faint echoes of football chants that once filled the air. The turf, once green with triumph, was now stained with fear and blood. Prisoners were given numbers instead of names, and among them were athletes, musicians, and civilians caught by mere association. Some recited prayers. Others hummed old songs to drown the sounds of torture. Yet above the cries, there lingered an unthinkable irony. This was still called a stadium, and in the world's eyes, still a place for sport. As weeks passed, the dictatorship sought to restore an illusion of normalcy. Newspapers were censored, foreign journalists were expelled, and FIFA officials arriving for World Cup preparations were escorted through clean hallways, carefully hidden from the horrors beneath. The dictatorship needed football to be its stage, a global spectacle to show that Chile was stable and in control. What better way to do that than through the World Cup qualifiers of 1974? And so, while the screams in the tunnels of Estadio Nacional still echoed through the cold nights, bureaucrats in both Santiago and Zurich began discussing dates, teams, and fixtures, the machinery of sport turning obliviously over a graveyard. The irony was cruel and perfect. The world's most beautiful game was about to be played in the world's most haunted stadium.